Jim the Ape Want Proof. Hello again, humans. It is I, Jim the Ape, and my last video turned out to be one of, if not the most divisive video I've ever made. Now, normally I wouldn't talk about the feedback I got for a previous video in the next one, but since the video I'm responding to today is so short, I figure I can spare a few minutes to do just that. I'll figure out the timestamp for when I actually start talking about today's video and put it up on the screen now. So, when the video I made in response to Steven Crowder on the subject of democratic socialism first went up, a lot of the initial comments were pretty negative. I wouldn't say hateful necessarily, but they were mostly in disagreement with me. And at first, I didn't feel too happy about that. After all, I don't think anyone likes to be criticized. But by no means was I emotionally crippled, nor did I want to erase said negative comments from existence, as that goes against my core principle of freedom of expression. But thankfully, there came some comments from people who were more on my side, and at least one person who was mixed. And as far as my insignificant, irrelevant feelings are concerned, that was a relief. And the more I observed the emerging debate, the better I felt. And ultimately, I decided that it was good that I made that video, because despite it clearly not being my best, it sparked more of a debate than any of my previous videos. So, as nice as it is to have an audience that enjoys my content, it's better to have people disagree with me every once in a while and call me out on my mistakes than it would be if everyone was just a sycophantic fan of mine who kissed my ass and called me a god no matter what I did. So with that in mind, let's actually talk about some of the criticism, shall we? First one that I'd like to address is that I got all my ideas from TJ Kirk because I mentioned him in the video. While he and I may have similar ideas on the subject, I wasn't citing him as a source. I was merely acknowledging that he's an inspiration of mine due in large part to his give no fucks attitude and willingness to call out stupidity on both sides of the political spectrum. The next point I'd like to respond to is that my entire video was just an ad hominem. Look, I know that's probably one of like 2 logical fallacies that you know of, with the other one being straw man, but no, I didn't commit an ad hominem once in the entire video. An ad hominem would be me saying, well, you said or did X, with X being something completely unrelated to the argument at hand, therefore you're wrong. The closest thing I even did to that was made a joke in the intro before I showed any clips or even mentioned Steven Crowder by name that he likes to make unfunny comedy sketches and dress up like a woman to try to make some point about trans people. That's it. Most of my video was just me trying to explain that I believe in a certain amount of universal healthcare coverage for tax-paying legal citizens and maybe some tax-funded degree programs. But then again, there is apparently a contingent of people who hear universal healthcare and go, socialism! Like they're Joseph fucking McCarthy and it's the Red Scare again. And I guess now is as good a time as any to just reiterate that the purpose of my video was to try and explain from a layman's perspective the difference between single-payer healthcare and full-on Marxist communism. Granted, I didn't do a very good job, but I thought I at least made it pretty clear that I wasn't talking about making the entire economy socialist, just a limited amount of healthcare and possibly, but not necessarily, some college degree programs. Also, I'm not going to address the more basic sentiment of, you don't know what you're talking about, because I padded the actual video in question with tons of qualifiers stating quite clearly that I am not an economic or political expert and that I've done no research on the topic. At least I'm honest enough to know what I don't know and admit when my knowledge is limited. But I would like to address the idea that socialism in any form is bad, to which I would ask, do you drive on roads? Do you use public transportation? Do you count on the police to keep you safe or firefighters to stop your house from burning to the ground? If you answered yes to any or all of these questions, congratulations! You use a form of socialism. All of the things I just mentioned are paid for by tax dollars and are are made available to all citizens. Granted, some of the things do have a cost to the individual, i.e. bus fare, toll roads, etc., but they work in much the same way that I happen to think healthcare should work. At least the life or death kind of healthcare. And someone said the police and firefighters aren't socialized, they're a necessity for a functional society, or something like that. To which I would ask, can't they be both? Another criticism that I kind of figured I was going to get was about the social contract thing that I mentioned in the video. Because I knew people would picture a literal contract in their head as a single document where you're basically signing away your freedom to the government in exchange for certain rights and privileges that the government itself gives you. Well, it's kind of like that, but it's not one singular document. It's everything from your birth certificate to your driver's license, your social security card, your tax forms, your voter registration card. Basically every piece of paper that identifies you and connects you to this bureaucratic system we're living in is a part of the social contract. If you live in the system and wish to participate in the benefits of the system, you must also contribute to the system, and that means paying your fucking taxes. If you don't like it, go live in the woods somewhere and build your own house using tools you made yourself. And don't use any resources from society or else you're a fucking hypocrite. Next, some people were saying how it's not even that hard to be in the 1%, or at least it doesn't take as high an income as one would think. Which to me just makes it even worse, because if that's true, then the remaining 99% of the population are even poorer by comparison. And as much as I hate to even use this argument because it's basically an appeal to emotion, would it really destroy the entire country just to make sure that people with life-threatening illnesses don't have to worry about leaving their families destitute due to medical bills even after they die? I don't happen to think so, but what I do think is that Alan Grayson was basically right. He may have oversimplified it, mind you, but he was basically right.
If you get sick in America, this is what the Republicans want you to do. If you get sick, America, the Republican health care plan is this. Die quickly. That's right. The Republicans want you to die quickly if you get sick.
And finally, someone said, "We live on a flat earth created by Yahweh. Evolution is a hoax." Well, I can't argue with that logic. Mainly because it's incomprehensibly stupid and has nothing to do with the subject of the video, but also because it's just so perfect. Anyway, enough rambling about my last video, let's move on to the subject of today's video. As a matter of fact, this video also came up as an ad, ironically before a video by TJ Kirk, who I mentioned before is one of my major influences here on YouTube. And it struck me as interesting because it's animated quite nicely, but the ideas being espoused by the narration, I'm not so sure I agree with. I'm not so sure I completely disagree with them either, but let's get into it and we'll find out together. Okay, so for those of you just listening, this video starts off with words appearing on screen saying, "People say that prostitution is a choice. Is it?" To which my initial response is yes and no. There are societal pressures in place that make it an easy money-making choice for women who are poor and desperate enough, and because it's illegal and punishable by law in most places in the US, some women are forced into it by shady pimps who threaten to beat, rape, and/or kill them if they don't comply. But since every issue is more nuanced and full of gray areas than this literally black and white animation, there are some women who do it because they actually want to do it, either because they love having sex and getting paid for it, or they simply don't care about their end of the exchange because they don't see it as them losing a part of themselves. Anyway, I'm sure we can get into some more detail later in the video. I just wanted to get my initial thoughts out there first and foremost. Let's continue.
Most of us today have heard stories of the millions of women and children forced into prostitution through human trafficking. We're aware and we're grieved.
Quick point here, but isn't it funny how it's always women and children? That tells me one of two things. Either men don't even have the option to go into prostitution because nobody needs dick badly enough to have to buy it, or women and children are the only demographics of people we're supposed to give a shit about. Again, it's quite possibly a combination of both, and maybe some other reasons that I'm not thinking of at the moment.
But what about those women in prostitution who weren't trafficked? Did those women willfully choose prostitution?
Technically, yes, they did. Like I said, there may be some factors at play like financial desperation, which may make some non-trafficked prostitutes less likely to say that they chose to go into that particular line of work. But to act as though no woman ever would like sex and money enough to go into a job where they get plenty of both shows a lack of understanding of the diversity of thought that human beings tend to display. And if you ask me, I'd say it takes away women's agency, at least in your mind, to believe that to be the case. Just ask Mercedes Carrera. She's an engineer and an insanely athletic woman who can probably do just about anything she wants, and yet she still does porn. Why? Because she loves it. She's said many times before that she loves doing it, and that is evidenced by her continuous appearances in newly produced scenes long after she's demonstrated the physical and mental abilities to do other things for money. And the only practical difference between porn and prostitution is the presence of recording equipment.
And are they as empowered, independent, and sexually liberated as many would have us believe?
Some of them are, some of them aren't. But I basically already said that, so this part is redundant. Moving on.
What we've come to see through years of research and thousands of conversations with prostituted women across the world.
I have to stop you right there. Now, clearly I'm not the kind of guy who does research, so I try not to be too demanding of the people I respond to in that regard. But if your research methodology is literally just talking to prostitutes, you're not going to get a very objective result, especially if the context of said conversations involves you asking them leading questions, or if you apply your own bias to their answers. So I'm not saying citation needed or anything like that, but I am a bit concerned with the idea of using conversations as a method of doing research.
Is a very different picture of prostitution. And the truth of this picture is that prostitution can be more accurately described as the choice of those with the fewest choices.
I'm sure whoever came up with that one was really proud of themselves. It's short, it's catchy, it's got the ironic repetition of the word choice, but even though I can see where you're going with this and the point you're trying to make, it's still just a slogan, and it doesn't necessarily represent reality, at least not 100% of the time.
See, nearly without fail, women enter prostitution from a position of vulnerability.
Key word, nearly. I'm sorry to keep harping on this point, but this is what bothers me about when SJWs are going through their whole women are victims spiel. I can't help but think, what about the ones who aren't? And yet so many people lack the nuance to ever acknowledge that in their videos, because everyone has their little narrative that they want to push, so God forbid they let any facts or counterexamples get in the way of that.
Many women, quote unquote, choose prostitution as underage children.
And even when quote-unquote underage children quote-unquote choose to have sex with adults, it's called quote-unquote statutory rape, and it's quote-unquote illegal, and the quote-unquote adult goes to quote-unquote prison.
Some as young as 12.
Translation, that's the youngest age we could find, so that's the one we're mentioning. And mind you, I'm not saying that underage prostitution and statutory rape aren't bad things. I'm just pointing out that this video is conflating those things with adult prostitution and saying that none of it is ever a conscious choice on the part of the presumed female prostitute. And that's why I'm saying that this argument takes away women's agency, or just pretends that they don't have any to begin with.
This so-called choice is often heavily influenced by prior sexual abuse.
Loosely connected, but mostly unrelated point I'd like to make here. Men who abuse women often were abused by their mothers as children. There is such a thing as a cycle of violence, and abuse victims can become abusers themselves. Or they can just become accustomed to it and put up with more abuse throughout their lives. Neither extreme justifies the abuse, mind you, but it very well could be that in some cases, both are at work. I.e., a boy is abused by his mother and grows up to abuse a woman who's been abused before and just passively accepts it. So that may have been more relevant than I initially thought.
It is influenced by the unrelenting messages from the media.
Oh, here we go again. Another let's blame all society's ills on the vague boogeyman of the media kind of video. Look, the various news and entertainment mediums that people engage in may have some influence over how those people act, but for the most part, they just react to the reality we already live in. Art is meant to imitate life far more than the reverse. diverse.
Pop culture and society that communicate that a woman's primary value is her sex appeal.
Well, I don't think that that's a woman's only source of value, and on an individual level, it's probably not even close to the primary value of a great many women. But it's not exactly the most outlandish thing to say that women in general have been valued for sex appeal going back centuries or even millennia. See, in early tribal civilizations, and even before that, men and women developed different roles. Basically, men did the hunting for food and the building of domiciles, and women would take care of cooking as well as child rearing and other domestic duties. In short, men protected and provided while women did the caretaking. Or, to put it another way, women traded sex and housekeeping duties for children and security. So over time, men became stronger and more capable of protecting their households, and women became more sexually appealing and more capable of nurturing their children. Fast forward to today, and we have enough diversity of thought to move away from these tendencies more than ever before, but there are still many examples of people still fitting within those roles.
Many prostituted women and children come from families broken by poverty, addiction, and mental illness.
It's true that prostitution is a way to make money relatively quickly, and it only requires something that literally everyone is born with, a body. And yes, prostitution is prevalent among the poor, just like most other crimes. So did you ever think that at least part of the problem might be the fact that it's illegal and therefore completely unregulated?
Many are homeless, orphaned, refugees, or suffer some form of social disadvantage.
Okay, the homeless thing is kind of funny because a majority of homeless people are men, and apparently we've already established that male prostitutes don't even exist. I mean, I didn't, but this video seems to be implying that, at least by omission. But what strikes me about that sentence is the last part, because some form of social disadvantage could mean fucking anything. For example, I'm fat. Is that a social disadvantage? I'm also not very talkative when I'm around strangers or just in public in general. That's definitely a social disadvantage. My point is, just listing vaguely negative things that might have some correlation with prostitution doesn't make it not a choice.
One formerly prostituted woman wrote about the sentiment of choosing prostitution. She said, "When I think about my choices, they were simply these: have men on and inside you, or continue to suffer homelessness and hunger."
Cool story, bro. And when I say that, what I mean is that what you've just provided is anecdotal evidence. Or, since it doesn't really prove anything in and of itself, it would be more appropriate to just call it an anecdote. And I would say something about homelessness as it relates to a certain individual for whom having men on and inside her is a constant fantasy, but whenever I mention that particular person, I get more negative comments than when I talk about democratic socialism.
Take your pick. Make your choice. Prostitution preys upon the most vulnerable in our society.
Prostitution doesn't prey on anyone. Do you know why? Because prostitution is not a sentient being. You know who does prey on people, though? Pimps and sex traffickers. And because prostitution is illegal, pimps can threaten their workers with violence, take all their money, beat them if they don't make enough, and even rape them to break them in or some sick shit like that. But if prostitution were legalized, decriminalized, and turned into a regulated business, you would see professional escort services popping up where it's all done under contract and with consent from both parties. And you'd probably see STD screening requirements for both workers and clients, much like the ones required of porn performers. It would become a much safer, much less exploitative profession as a whole, at least in my estimation, and it would probably become a booming business just like the pot industry has become in states where that's legal. That's why I say that the biggest problem with prostitution is that it is illegal.
Coercing individuals through life circumstances to trade sex for the hope of a better life.
So is prostitution what makes people poor? Is prostitution to blame for children being abused by their parents? Did prostitution kick your puppy? Seriously though, I really didn't cut anything out there. You said,
prostitution preys upon the most vulnerable in our society, coercing individuals through life circumstances to trade sex for the hope of a better life.
So that means you're claiming that prostitution is coercing people to trade sex for the hope of a better life. To which I would ask, how? Like I said before, prostitution is not a sentient being. So how does it do anything, let alone enact some evil scheme to trick people into selling their consent for money? I don't get it.
Or even to simply survive.
Oh, so now it's not just tricking people into selling their consent for money. Now it's holding a gun to their head and screaming, "Suck dick or die, slut! Your choice!" Get the fuck out of here. Prostitution isn't doing these things. If anything, it's shitty people doing them.
If this is the truth of prostitution,
It isn't. At least not all the time. And I would argue that the way you present it, with all the melodramatic hyperbole, it's probably not the truth of prostitution even most of the time.
then prostitution is not a choice. If we truly care about the dignity, safety, and empowerment of women and children,
But again, you don't give a fuck about men, do you? I realize that may be an assumption based on omission, but it really does seem that way, at least to me. And I find only one of those things to be important. Safety. Because dignity is subjective and ultimately meaningless. After all, freedom of speech necessitates that anyone and everyone has the right to speak to you and about you in an undignified manner. And empowerment is utterly meaningless feminist jargon that's been tossed around like confetti at a parade for decades now. But yes, I agree that safety is important, especially from physical harm. Now, can we please stop mutilating baby genitals?
then we must fight for a world without prostitution.
You are never going to win that fight. There is a reason prostitution is referred to as the world's oldest profession. As I've explained before, it's in human nature for men to seek sex and for women to seek security. Boiled down to its simplest form, that's what prostitution is. Only the sex is a one-time thing, and the security comes in the form of direct monetary currency, rather than years of food and shelter for somewhat regular instances of sex. So really, the best thing you can aspire to is a world without illegal prostitution, where people can make freelance business transactions with their own bodies, and businesses can form offering that service professionally, all without fear of being thrown in jail. Because when it's out in the open and regulated like any other business, a lot of the problems you talked about in this video will improve significantly.
We must fight for a world where our most vulnerable are offered real choices.
Don't say that. You'll trigger the conservatives in my audience. They really don't like the idea of helping out less fortunate people.
And we're asking you to choose this fight. Share this video. Tell the world the truth about prostitution.
That it would be so much less of a problem if it were legalized, decriminalized, and regulated? Okay. Also, the name at the end there, Exodus Cry, makes me think that this might have been some religious thing. But I have no idea, so I'll save the arguments against that for a possible future video. After all, I'm trying to branch out and try new things on my channel, and one of my ideas for doing so was to tackle religious apologia. Anyway, that's the end of the video, so follow their advice and share this video, as well as give it a thumbs up if you liked it. I always appreciate that. If you didn't, I don't care. If you like my content, please make sure you're subscribed and click the bell icon to get notified when I upload a new video. Follow me on Twitter and BitChute, where I upload my videos earlier than YouTube, usually by several hours to about half a day. I'm planning on looking into alternative platforms like Steemit and DTube, as recommended by the aforementioned TJ Kirk, as well as some more fan funding options like Maker Support, or turning my personal PayPal account into a business account so that I don't have to dox myself by giving out the link. And I'm still planning on looking into the idea of starting a t-shirt store, but I still don't know if there's enough interest to make that viable. Let me know what you think in the comments. And of course, if you really like what I do here and want to support me, you can do so by pledging $1 or $2, or maybe even more, to me on Patreon. Any amount would be greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for watching. I'll catch you next time. Stay great, apes.